My name is Anthony Pasero. I am a visiting assistant professor in the Hispanic Studies department. And with me today is Leah Newman, who is the director and curator of the Van Every Smith Galleries here at Davidson College. And it is our tremendous pleasure to welcome Diego Luis. Diego Luis, for those of you who have not met him or maybe started, just this year, Diego Luis was actually here at Davidson for the last 2 years. He joined Davidson College in the fall of 2020 as a visiting assistant professor in the humanities program. And he is now an assistant professor in the history department at Tufts University. Diego Luis holds a PhD in history from Brown. Diego synchronizes art with scholarship to tell human stories of diaspora and mobility with a focus on Latin America and the Philippines. His photography has been published by NPR, the Latin American Studies Association, Smithsonian Folkways, and numerous other venues. He also has a book under contract with Harvard University Press entitled The First Asians in the Americas, A Trans-Pacific History, which, and I quote, traces both free and enslaved Asian mobility from the Philippines to Mexico, Central America, Peru, and Spain from the 16th to early 19th centuries. In particular, it examines how Asian subjects encountered and responded to colonial era racialization with an emphasis on cross-cultural exchanges, social mobility, and resistance to enslavement. So in addition to his work as a professor, Diego has also conducted extensive archival work in Mexico, Spain, the Philippines, and the US. Diego's photography, and this is a quote that I've drawn from Diego, your website, ranges from documentary work to street photography to landscapes. His series of photographies include Afro-Cuba, Manila, Magic and Ordinary, protest photography, mountainscapes, and the US-Mexico border. So Diego Luis, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just one word before we begin is Diego Luis's exhibit. The full title is A Few Missing Visuals of the Crisis. So thank you for being here today, Diego.
All right, thank you very much, Tony, for that introduction. It's curious to me too how the work, the scholarship on early modern Asian diasporas to the Americas links with the photography portfolios, because at first glance it may seem, oh, okay, 16th century, and then you've got 21st century photography. What's the link here? But it's really about trying to humanize the experience of movement. And that's what I do with my scholarship, just like trying to unearth these stories that have laid buried in archives for hundreds of years. And I think for my photography, I tried to do something very similar, to take an abstract idea and make it material or human in some way. And in this case, that's precisely the border, which I think for many of us, and I'm no exception, was more an idea than a physical space. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to give some context to the photos, the exhibition, and then I'm going to walk us through a few, some of which are in the exhibition and some of which pertain to the broader portfolio, but will help me tell this story that I would like to convey for you all today. So a little bit about myself. I mentioned that the border was more an idea than a physical space to me. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, very far from the US-Mexico border, and was in the school system there in the early 2000s in a private school, private middle school that was named after a Confederate general, Harding, and is a school in the suburbs that was in the 70s was founded as a white flight school. So that gives you kind of context of that early environment. It's relevant because in the years immediately following following 9/11, the border all of a sudden took on this larger than life quality as any from abroad or any kind of unsanctioned movement was perceived as a national security threat in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And it's this interesting contrast because right before the attacks, Vicente Fox, then president of Mexico, had just met with George W. Bush. This moment of optimism about unprecedented North American, not only security guarantees, but also increased movement across the border and pathways to citizenship, and all of that was part of the rhetoric in that moment. And then all of a sudden, the 9/11 attack happened, the border shut down, and there had always been this, for decades, this kind of negative rhetoric around border crossing, border movement, and asylum seekers across the U.S.-Mexico border, but it intensified after. That was something that I experienced in this particular school environment as well, where my predominantly white conservative classmates vented their parents' frustration of the situation on me. And I became the border crossing Mexican to them and was harassed almost every day simply on the basis of my appearance. This daily abuse was to such an extreme that when asked to create an art project on where I came from, I think this was maybe 5th or 6th grade, I made a norteño style sombrero to represent myself. So I had deeply internalized white fear about who I was. And of course, my own depiction of myself was itself a caricature based on the prevailing rhetoric in that moment about who was crossing the border and what defined them. The truth, however, is that I'm not Mexican or Central American or South American. I have Chinese Cuban on my dad's side and on my mom's side. She's from the US. Neither my parents or I had to endure a harrowing border crossing. And at that time in my life, I didn't even speak Spanish. But nonetheless, the idea of the border and what it represented in that moment had already entered my life, even though I did not have a personal experience with the space of the border itself. So fast forward to 2019, which is when I conducted this photography portfolio. I was in graduate school at Brown University, getting a PhD in history with a focus on the early modern period. So not at all a specialist on the border or even the 20th and 21st centuries. My friends and I, like many of you, watched in horror as the Trump era unfolded all around us. And just to list a couple of the things that were on our minds, the Muslim ban had recently been instated. Jeff Sessions had proposed to lock up Muslim Americans in camps on the basis that FDR had done the same with Japanese Americans during World War II through Executive Order 9066. But crucially, some stories of the horrible conditions at newly constructed detention centers were beginning to circulate in the media. Crucially, this was before the Remain in Mexico policy that forced asylum seekers to wait out their cases in Mexico. So many of those who had recently been released for detention and were seeking asylum were in the US in that moment. So there were 3 of us with no background in border history, which I think is something I want to state and I think is very important, decided that we needed to travel to South Texas to witness what was happening. And to bring the border out of abstraction for us, to make it a real thing, a physical space populated by real people and not just numbers or headlines. So my role in this was as photographer and as a Spanish speaker. The other 2 graduate students that conducted this trip were Julian Saporiti of Nono Boy, who wanted to create music and host several concerts for activists and migrants. He ended up creating a song from this trip called Close Your Eyes and Dream of Flowers. And then the third was Juan Betancourt, who would be a videographer and also a Spanish speaker for the trip. The itinerary began in Atlanta, Georgia, with a concert and Q&A with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where my wife, Hillary Lee, worked at that time. This nonprofit advocates for the release of immigrants from detention. And it was important to one, I was in Atlanta at the time, but to begin there with advocates. We then flew to Houston, drove to San Antonio, again, to meet with advocates, then on to Crystal City to see the remains of the Japanese American incarceration site. So we're thinking about history in parallel or as a cyclical concept. Then to a place called the Holding Institute in the border town of Laredo. And then finally to Dilley, Texas, to see the detention center there and meet with members of the Dilley Pro Bono Project who are doing people held in detention there. So this exhibition is my attempt to capture what we saw and to make the border more real and human than it had been for me growing up, right? Just this abstract idea. I was shooting at 50mm and 20mm focal lengths. For the exhibition, I edited all but one photo in black and white. And in what follows, I'm going to show some photos from the exhibition and from the larger portfolio, as I mentioned. So just to give an example of what I've been talking about to make the border real, this is the space that separates the US from Mexico, you see right here. And it's really powerful to see in person because you get the sense of the arbitrariness of the arbitrary nature of it, that there's a line between two states and that someone standing on one side is suddenly a criminal versus the other side, right? Okay, so the trip, as I mentioned, began in Houston. And I wanted to show this. This is a Vietnamese American Buddhist temple, and we began here with prayer and to ask for a blessing for our trip, but also to show that South Texas is an extremely diverse place with overlapping diasporic movements. You know, it's not simply one thing or the other, and even if you're looking at people who are crossing the US-Mexico border, CBP publishes the figures, the statistics of people that they're detaining every year. And you look at those statistics, it's an extremely diverse group of people that are entering the US across that border. So I want to highlight that right here at the beginning, that there are overlapping migratory histories here. Okay. So this is Crystal City. It's the foundation of what's left. There's this big water tank and then the concrete bottom of what used to be a pool there. It's currently on a high school campus, and you know, other than one marker and sort of the words that are written on this water tank, it's almost impossible to know that it's there. Like many of the other incarceration sites from that period. But Crystal City is particularly important because it held not only Japanese Americans, but also Japanese Latin Americans, predominantly from Peru. And a lot of people don't know, but the history of the militarization of the border overlaps between Asian movement and also Latin American movement. So, and it dates back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which targeted Chinese, but also ensnared anyone who looked Asian, including Japanese as well. And so the result of this is that no longer able to enter the US, many Chinese and other Asians went to places like Mexico to cross into the US across the border. And it's through this policy and the harsh reaction to these late 19th century border crossers that results over time in a militarization of the border. You know, militias and physical presence to prevent people who were deemed who are racialized in such a way to prevent them from entering the country, to monitor that. And Erica Lee has a fantastic book on this, if any of you are interested. But this is Julian Saporiti of No No Boy conducting field recordings here. He incorporated them into the music that he produced about our trip. But again, it for me really emphasizes that on this land, there are so many histories of detention, concentration, racialization of multiple migrant groups. And when we talk about one, we need to think about these in parallel, that what's happening now has a precedent in US history. And that's very important to keep in mind. Okay. These next two are from the Holding Institute, which has a very unfortunate name, but it's a person's name, Holding, right? It's Methodist, if I recall correctly, and run by Pastor Mike, who opened the space and made it available for people who have just come out of detention with nowhere to go. It's capable of holding around 50 to 60 people every night. He offers free language courses, free food, clothing, because coming out of detention, all of their clothes are taken usually, and they're just given a standard issue set of shirt and pants. And so when they arrive at the Holding Institute, well, when they get off the buses, there's someone from the Holding Institute to meet them there in Laredo. This is right on the border. Then they're brought to the Holding Institute, given a place to stay. Oftentimes people will stay there from several days to even a couple weeks in some cases. These folks are people who are waiting for their family members to show up. Sometimes they've been separated. They're contacting other family members or connections they have in the US to try to meet them later on. They're given meals. They're even given some forms of professional training in some cases. And Pastor Mike prays for everyone who comes through there as well. And it's all volunteer. I mean, they're run on grants through religious affiliation. It's really remarkable what they do. And going there was just an overwhelmingly powerful experience. Just hearing the stories of people passing through there. And what I wanted to emphasize as well in these photos is, you get the sense that people are waiting around. And the kids are sort of trying to content themselves by playing games, but oftentimes they were very upset, even listening to music during Julian's concert. And it's this space of tension, it's this in between. It's not a detention center, but it's also not a new home either. I'm going to share one story. Well, sorry, before I get to that, I also wanted to mention that there were many Black Latin American people who were there, Hispanic people. And that's a story that doesn't often get shown in news headlines as well. That, I mentioned the diversity of people who are crossing the border, but as a Black person crossing, there's a kind of double exclusion that happens. One is by virtue of having Latin American citizenship, and the people you see in these pictures are from Central America, from Nicaragua. And the second exclusion is by skin color. That immigrants, and certainly upon arriving in the US, you have anti-Blackness. That's also a defining feature of their experience. But I want to talk to you about this woman in the middle who we met. Her name is Anaí. and this picture to me is very special. You know, we set it up at like a family photo, although only the mother on the left and her two children are related, but you can kind of see the connections that are born of a traumatic experience. And after everything, Anai is still able to smile through it, which I thought was very special. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She was a dental hygienist in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And at age 30, she left for the US with her younger brother due to pressure from extortionists and also a lack of professional opportunities. Like many others, she planned to cross the border by paying coyotes, but the one she found and hired turned out to be a human trafficker with links to the drug cartels. They betrayed her and her brother and allowed her to be kidnapped near the border, where she was held captive for 2 months. During this time, she witnessed numerous instances of sexual violence and even the murder of other immigrants seeking a better life. Luckily, her family managed to pay the ransom, and they were released near the Rio Grande, where they were soon captured by border enforcement and taken to a detention center, which she describes as the hielera, or the icebox. In detention, she witnessed numerous abuses that were verbal, physical, and legal in nature. And after a month and a half, she was finally released in Laredo, where we met her. And this is how she describes her experience in her own words. Quote, "The dangerous and deadly journey to the American dream was not easy. You lose everything, even your life. When you leave your country behind, you leave your loved ones, and you encounter the most dangerous route you could have ever imagined. During this route, you deal with one of the most dangerous challenges in life, which is organized crime. This route is not easy. You see all sorts of things: kidnapping, rape, torture, and death. During this route, I was kidnapped and tortured. This is still my greatest nightmare. It was a complete hell. I suffered many blows, both physical and verbal abuse, alongside migrants from other countries. I saw the worst: children suffering for their parents' American dream. Our only hope in those moments was God. In those moments, you really come to value your life. It reminds you that nothing is impossible for God. I saw young women being raped. I saw how they burned trucks full of innocent people just because they could not pay for their kidnapping. Because life is paid with a high price at the border. And that was only the beginning of our torment. In the North American territory, the ICE detention centers awaited us. There you begin a nightmare that will last a lifetime," end quote. And again, after all of this, when we met her, she was, you know, after telling the story, which basically left us in tears, was still able to smile, which I think is just extraordinary. And in this moment, she still didn't even know where her younger brother was. She was waiting for him to show up. But after we parted, Anai miraculously managed to find her brother, and together they went to New Jersey to live with her sister. During the pandemic, she worked 2 years at a restaurant under a manager who shamelessly exploited her and other migrants for the lack of access to legal recourse in this country. But eventually she was hired as a cleaning aide at an optics center. And about 6 months ago, she was awarded asylum and granted a green card. She now works at a dentist's office and plans on taking college courses on dental hygiene to validate her degree so that she can practice her profession in the States. So following her story through the pandemic has just been the most extraordinary thing for the three of us who met her in this situation to see what's happened. Okay, moving along. After this, well, after all of that, we went to a bar for drinks, and then because we needed to, and then we after we left Laredo, we went to the Dilley Detention Center, which I've depicted here as the largest, at least at the time, was the largest family detention center in the US. And it was particularly important for us because we had just come from Crystal City. We just heard the stories of people who had been locked up here and elsewhere. But But thinking about this in parallel to the old photos, the Ansel Adams photos of the detention centers, the incarceration camps during World War II, and just seeing the rows of buildings and the surveillance and all of that was a shocking parallel for us. And you see this kind of cyclical practice of the criminalization of immigrants. And you notice that this scene here is so bright. There are lights everywhere. And of course, it's to ensure that nobody is able to escape, that if anyone, for any reason, is outside of the buildings, that they're in plain view and well illuminated for the people who are working as guards there. Dili itself completely revolves around this camp center. It's the major sort of economic opportunity for folks in town. It's a very small town, very impoverished town. And this detention center, well, that's to say the detention center is looked upon very positively in this context, right? Because it's an opportunity for social mobility for the people who live in the town. The detention center is also located right next to the local prison. So you immediately have this conjunction in space between immigrants and people who have been convicted of some crime. I also wanted to show you this image. It's taken from the top of the cabin where the Dili Pro Bono project. This is a group that offers translation service or attempts to connect people in detention to legal recourse, attorneys and things like that. So this is the top of the cabin where this group stays. And this is at night, and I got the idea to do a long exposure there from another photographer named Marnie Shadelman. And you can see immediately just how bright this area is. This is still a few miles away from the detention center, but it's so bright that the whole area for several miles around, it's like there's no night there. So this is my last image. This is from inside the cabin, the concert that Julian did for the Dili Pro Bono project. What I really want to emphasize here is that this is a humanitarian crisis, and it's often categorically dismissed as such through the language of criminality, which is a political language, right? It's deployed for particular purposes. But what that does is it takes attention away from the lives of people who are making this crossing, who are living at the border. And that's fundamentally a human experience. If nothing else, I aspire for the exhibition to encourage you to, if you can, travel to see what's happening for yourself, to talk to people, to lend a hand to folks in need. Because we knew nothing about what was happening there, basically. I mean, I'm a historian, but I don't study the border. And it was really out of this idea that we have a moral obligation to witness what's happening that drove us to go. And that drove me to create this portfolio. Because it's happening on US soil, right? Oftentimes we think about these terrible things that are happening in other countries, and and that may certainly be the case, but it's rare, more rare that you see in popular media an internal look at what's happening here too, in refugee camps like the Holding Institute by the border. And we don't see it in places like Davidson or even where I am now. It's outside of most of our daily realities, but the border is not an abstraction. It's a physical place. It's a land rent by the maws of history, and where stories like that of Anaï are unfolding every day. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. And I would love to hear your questions or comments.
Diego, thank you so much for your presentation, your talk, and for sharing your experiences with your trip, your photography. Anyone who has any questions, or the floor is now open for open discussion, or anyone who has any questions, if you'd like to ask Diego anything about his experience, about his photography, the floor is now open.
Can I ask a question?
By all means.
Thank you so much for the talk, and also for exhibiting the works with us. You specified when you traveled to the border that the three of you were without border experiences. It seemed very important to you to mention that this project was about trying to understand something that was abstract to you. It was a way of making something abstract more real. And like that notion of using art to witness something, to understand, to reckon with something, to illuminate things for other people, that is a very familiar way for artists to work, right? But one of the pitfalls of photography, maybe more than other media, maybe not film, but similarly, is that photographers can often impose their own biases on the subjects. It happens even when it's not their intention. So I wanted to hear from you about how you work around that. How much editing happens when you go back through the works? How do you avoid imposing your own bias?
That's a fantastic question. I think to some extent it is unavoidable, because at the end of the day, I'm the one that's standing behind the camera, and I'm the one that's snapping the photo and sort of determining the perspective, and, you know, and editing it and all of that. So, so I think that, yeah, to some extent it's unavoidable, but at the same time, you know, you saw a lot of the photos dealt with land, the perspective of someone who's witnessing, who's looking at the border, who is trying to draw, you know, you saw in that first image, the space together, right? So there's that on the one hand. On the other hand, there's, you know, before taking a photo of anybody, we got their permission to take a photo. So, you know, it's, and that has its own complications, because on the one hand, there are people who are conscious that a camera is present and might be altering their behavior for that reason. But on the other hand, it was important for us to be present, you know, not just to be like distanced people coming from far away just to kind of do some trauma tourism. You know, we were there to talk to people, like Anaí, to get to know them, to follow up with them. And, you know, these are people that we're still in touch with, and to also to make a contribution to places like the Holding Institute. You know, they told us that they were out of underwear for people, and we realized that we were in a position to do something about it, you know? So we went to the store and we bought them underwear because that's what they needed. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, we are coming from a position of not being specialists in the area, but I think that there are different kinds of interventions that need to be made with regards to this history. One from the side of specialists who are able to go in and target particular areas and know exactly what needs to be done. Lawyers, for example, there's a lot of important work that lawyers and, you know, the pro bono people too that are doing. But this is something that we saw that we could do. So, you know, Julian is talking about the experience through songs at his concerts, and Q&As after the concert, bringing attention to Dawn, to the experiences of people that we met. And the way that I felt I could do it was through photography. So, yeah, fantastic question.
Diego, I want to ask you about your moral imperative. You said we have a moral obligation to witness. And in my own work in Holocaust studies and trauma literature, the idea of witnessing to someone else's testimony is a really fundamental sort of theoretical structure in how we organize that sort of knowledge, and our role as witnesses, either firsthand or secondhand or thirdhand, through representations of trauma. But in that paradigm, there's a testimony. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what is given to you. I mean, you've engaged with these people, with these human beings in their moment. How is that testimony like? Just their sort of presence? Or is the landscape a kind of testimony for you? What are you witnessing with that theoretical rubric of sort of honoring the testimony or respecting the testimony? I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I draw inspiration from the context that you're talking about, and I think of testimony in as broad of terms as possible. And I think that that comes from my training as a historian and thinking of the archive in as broad of terms as possible. All of it is testifying to a particular historical experience, and as someone who is there, I felt that it was my obligation to absorb as much of it as possible. And of course, just like the archive, it's not going to be an unmediated experience because it passes through my own subjectivity. But nonetheless, I felt that it was valuable to share. It also comes from my research on, other kinds of traumatic experiences of mobility in the early modern world, and how important it is today to have the testimony, albeit mediated, of people who were physically there and able to talk about it. So I felt like that was an important thing for me to do when I was physically there. And of course, after you leave, you have 100 ideas of what you could have done in addition, or could have done further after you leave. But I think that's just, becomes fuel for the next project or the next trip back. I don't think of it as, a portfolio. It's completed because it's been published in some venues, or it's been on exhibition. It's an unfolding, ongoing project that that is constantly trying to find good answers to these questions and problematics of testimony and documentation of difficult and traumatic and violent experiences and histories.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed listening to you speak. One thing that you said that really stuck out in my head is when you were talking about like the detention center, and you were talking about how it's viewed by the people in the area of where the center is as like an opportunity for economic mobility. And I like could completely be misinterpreting, but I felt like I sensed you like kind of alluding to that hypocrisy in that statement, like considering that like people who maybe were in that detention center were seeking some sort of mobility for their lives. And I guess what I'm curious about is if you had conversations, like what more I was curious to hear more about your conversations, if you had any, with people in that community where that detention center is located. Like obviously you talk to people who were or are / whatever in the detention center, but the people in the town who you said a lot of them supported it. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, so the context of the town is, I mean, you're right. Yeah, there is an irony that, there is this narrative around the detention center being a source of social mobility, but also detaining people who are seeking the same thing, right? But it's also simply the reality of the town. And when we went to eat and started, and talk to people just from the town, like you would hear constantly like little comments that that are like, you know, yeah, like those people deserve to be there, you know, that sort of thing. Like really harsh stuff from people, but that's their reality. And the other piece of this that's in the exhibition, but that I didn't share when I was talking about it, is when we were there, you know, one afternoon we just kind of walked around this field, and there was a pickup truck that drove up next to us in this field, and the guy leans out of the pickup truck and says, "Are y'all like some illegals that are walking around here?" And we're like, like, I don't even know like where to begin with that, right? Because, but anyway, so you know, it's part of the culture of the town, right? That kind of racializing gaze that's so fundamental to the detention center itself. Yeah, so that was our experience there.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for that. I was gonna ask if you felt more like kind of going back to what you just said, like if you were worried about being in areas of such high tension, or if you felt like you were gonna get in trouble for your photography or wherever you were, or if you felt more relieved and like just like if you really enjoyed it like the whole time, like getting to take these pictures and that you're going to bring these things to light to the people that didn't really know about them or didn't really know what everything that you take pictures of looked like.
Well, I can't say I would use the words relief or enjoyment when I think back to that experience. Yeah, I mean, it was difficult. I think that being a witness is kind of traumatic in its own way. You know, these aren't stories that I experienced, but I mean, this is about acknowledging someone's humanity and listening to what they have to tell you. And it was a tremendously difficult experience for all of us. And you know, after we got back home from this trip, we didn't even talk about it for a long time. Like we needed just a month at least to process what happened. Yeah, I mean, regarding the first part of your question, you know, did we feel like in danger, or how do we feel about being in this kind of environment? And yeah, I mean, it was on our minds, you know, like in Laredo, like you could cut the tension with a knife, you know. It was an extremely tense town, especially at this historical moment. I mean, there were helicopters flying every day. The place we were staying, the owner of this like little motel, you know, he asked us one morning, like, "Oh, did you see some illegal immigrants running around here earlier today?" And you know, like that's the kind of rhetoric in a place like that. Like people are on, it's tense. People are on high alert. And but I mean, I don't know. That's the reality of being there, and we felt that, you know, regardless of that, like we needed to be there to document what we could about those situations. You know, standing outside of the detention center by the barbed wire, like we didn't know if someone was going to come up or how that would be received, but it was just important to do. So, so we just.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk, and I really enjoyed your photography. I'm from Texas. I come from like my mom is an immigrant, though she immigrated from Colombia. But I know you mentioned earlier that you experienced a disconnect growing up between like your own heritage and the kind of internalization of a stereotypical culture that doesn't really exist. And I know that like I at least experienced a lot of that growing up in Texas. My mom is Colombian and my dad is white, and people were always like, "Oh, you're Mexican." I also went to a predominantly white flight school in the suburbs. So I kind of understand that. But and then as well as like becoming a Spanish speaker later in life. And I was kind of wondering what, if any, effect did your trip and the experiences on your trip have, like, with your own personal identity. I know that especially like knowing Spanish in places like that is something that's really important when you're trying to connect with people. And I know, at least for me as a Spanish speaker, that's also been like, at least it's been profound in my life. And I was just wondering if, yeah, if anything changed for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that. You know, I identify strongly with that experience. And I mean, there's a couple of things I can say. One is, I think it was really moving and disturbing to see what was happening to people who shared an identification with me in this country. And, you know, I've been on the receiving end, as I mentioned, of a lot of this kind of harassment around people who, like, they have the Latin American origin, Hispanic who look Latino. And so, yeah, I mean, that was like a point of resonance for viewing that. And I mean, I can't say I'm an impartial observer, because like those were all the feelings that were coming out when I was taking these photos. The other thing that it did is it made me look at Cuba differently too. And when I went to Cuba in May 2020, and again in I think it was April or May of 2022, this year, it changed the way I took photos there too, and the way that I talk to people there, and kind of my interest in documenting what's going on there too. I mean, Cuba is going through a really rough time right now, for a lot of reasons, and most urgently because of the economic repercussions of the pandemic. And you know, the people don't have water, there are rolling blackouts all the time, and access to a lot of things. So it kind of changed the way I thought about where my own family history is rooted as well. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Diego, thank you again, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. I mean, I think timely is a word that really comes to mind, in the sense that I was just reading an article from November 6th, so from this month. The 2022 fiscal year proved the deadliest on record for people trying to cross the border. And we acknowledge that the reasons for seeking to cross the border are multifaceted. These include, and I quote from Alexandra Villarreal, fleeing unlivable poverty, persecution, hunger, climate change, and bloodshed. Dan Crocker, who is our director of the Dean Rusk International Studies program, wrote and said that the border is quite a story to be told, and now it's becoming an international border with Ukrainians and Haitians increasingly trying their luck and trying to cross. So the opportunity to be able to be here with you, Diego, to hear about your experiences, hear about everyone's thoughts, Scott's, Robbie's, Maite's, Amelia's. Thank you for sharing. Diego's exhibit, his photography will be up until December 7th. So until next Wednesday. And it was really important for us to really seize the moment to be able to, you know, host Diego on Zoom. So if you haven't yet seen his photography, it's on display in the lobby of Chambers, which is itself the space that we're used to sort of passing through and not really stopping. So if you have a chance within the next few days to just stop for a moment, contemplate his photography, take a moment to reflect, invite anyone who you know that might be interested. For the photograph of No No Boy, there is a QR code to the song that Diego has provided. And it really is something that is worth taking, more than a moment to just take in. So again, it will be on display until December 7th, but really until next Wednesday. So with that being said, Diego, if you have any final thoughts or comments, I want to open the space back up to you before we close the meeting.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you all again for attending, and for Leah and Tony for the opportunity. And Tony, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something that is not going away. It's only becoming more relevant and more dire. I think that's been the case with just about every humanitarian crisis through the COVID period, has become more acute in various ways, and the US-Mexico border is no exception. I mean, you can't imagine what the situation was like in these makeshift camps on the Mexico side. Remain in Mexico policy. Folks had to wait out their asylum cases on the Mexico side, but in the camps there, experiencing the pandemic, and those stories are still unfolding. And so yeah. Anyway, I offer the exhibition in the spirit of not only my own experience witnessing, but also to encourage you all to continue paying attention to this. I'd also like to recommend a really fantastic book that came out recently called Solito. It's I'm forgetting the author at this moment, but it's called Solito, and it's the experience. So this guy, he's from El Salvador. He crossed in the late 90s, and the book is from his voice as a child crossing multiple, Javier Zamora, that's right, crossing multiple borders alone from a very young age. And this book just came out. It's making waves, and it's a very important first person voice. So I just like to recommend that for folks who want to stay up to date with what's happening, and to continue experiencing the first person testimonies of people who cross.
Shani, thank you for the author information. I just checked, and Solito is available for in-store purchase at Main Street Books here on Main Street.
Nice. Good job, Main Street.
Main Street Books is run by Davidson grad.
That's right. I want to throw in a plug at the end that this exhibition was part of a trio of exhibitions, the other two being in the galleries at the Visual Arts Center, all sort of experiences of immigration, migration, thinking about borders. And so it was really important for us to have different perspectives on that topic. And so I really appreciate you participating, even though you left Davidson. I'm glad we were able to bring your work back for this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it.
It's great to see you, Diego.
Yeah,
Thank
you too, and
Thank
all of
you.
you who are familiar faces, former students, and yeah, it's great to see all of you.
Thanks, Leah and Tony, for organizing. Really, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who attended. Leah, thank you for co-moderating, for helping, and for organizing. Thank you for the text for Diego's bio, which is drawn from the exhibit website. And Diego, thank you again for being here.
No, thank you all.